Hey MiniWarGamers, welcome to another episode of The Machine Shop with Ash. Today we are going to be talking about competitive or standard game sizes. So now why would I want to talk about that? Well, it's kind of a phenomenon in wargaming that there exists an almost subconscious or how would you say, a subliminal understanding of what the right size or the right way to play a game is. Some of that's very conscious. Some miniature games will be published with sizes in mind, like a standard game size. For instance, Infinity, all of the missions in the main rulebook say that they are for 300 point size games. And that's become the standard game size for Infinity at 300 points, the intended scale, if you will. Whereas some games give you no guidelines really whatsoever as to what the appropriate size should be. Warhammer Fantasy Battle, Warhammer 40k being good examples of that. It doesn't really tell you what game size you should play. It tells you a rough guesstimation of how long games might take at a given size, but it doesn't try and curb you into a single size of game. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't creations and constructs outside of the rules of those games. We talked in another episode about formats and how organized play formats come into being for those games. So, for instance, Warhammer and Warhammer 40k both have a variety of different player packs or organized play packs or tournament packs or whatever. That's why I mentioned tournament games in here. I think that falls into the same category that recommend a game size or give you a standard game size to play. And people that play in those tournaments a lot or sort of have adopted a standard game size see that as being the right size of game to play or the right format to play inside of. So I thought that would be interesting to talk about. I think it's interesting to explore. So let's explore why we might be doing that, why it might be a good thing, and then what the hurdles and drawbacks that might be. All right, so the biggest pro I can think of there being a standard accepted way to play a game, so a standard format or game size, is that you can play with strangers the way you can play with your friends and have the best chance to both be on the same page from the time that starts. I've said this before about tournaments. One of the big positive things for tournaments is people who don't necessarily have a gaming group or a close group of friends that they play war games with or games in general go to tournaments a lot of times just to get to play the game that they're playing. I can't count the number of people I've said, so hey, where do you play tournament? And they say, well, I only usually play 3 or 4 times a year at tournaments like this. And they're not necessarily the guys in the head of the pack that play the game all the time, but they get to play 4 or 5 games over a weekend at a tournament. So one of the big benefits to a standard or tournament, competitive style way of playing a game that's sort of socially accepted is you can show up and play a stranger, right? You have a format that you can show up and play a stranger. You both probably got the same size armies. You're both experienced in the missions and scenarios or expectations of how you're going to play the game. And you can line up and play a stranger, and that's okay. Like, you guys will have the same expectations going into the game as far as the basic rules and the framework and the architecture of what you're about to accomplish together. So I think that's a big one. And I think for a lot of people who don't necessarily have a bunch of friends that they play with all the time, that floats out there in the world, that's a thing that people sort of have in the back of their minds is, I want to get into a game and build X size army so that I can play the right way, right? The socially acceptable or the standardized or competitive style format. It means that the first time they do play somebody else, they're probably playing the same way as them, or they're playing at least in the same size army, and they're collecting the same number of models. So it's good for strangers. It's good for strangers to be able to play other strangers and have a sort of unspoken social contract as how big a game they're going to play, and how that game's going to be played, either the missions or the scenario packs or whatever. So I think it also is useful and it gives people a benchmark to build towards. So if you are just getting into a game, and I talked about this when I talked about starting a new game, it's another episode, if you scroll down you can probably see below here somewhere in other episodes of the show, about how that's a useful thing to research, is if there's a standard or sort of like normal game size for games, it gives you a benchmark. So when you're basically like doing your wish listing and shopping around for how do I want to start getting into this game, or even if you're just starting a new army in an existing game, you tend to open a codex, crap an army book, start looking at your cards or whatever, go into War Room if you're playing War Machine, and plug in whatever that standard game size is in first. So like, when I build army lists now, like I'm thinking about starting, or extra expanding the tiny little Hordes army that I have, a Circle Warburst army. And when I fire up War Room, I just like automatically set my roster size to 50 points now. that's the size that like every War Machine game almost that I've played is 50-point games. It's like the standard game size. And so I find myself planning purchases that way, looking at my existing model collection and firing it in, seeing what I want to use and what I want to add or what I want to change or take out or whatever. So as far as benchmarking sort of how I'm progressing or collecting or building an army, having that sort of architectural blueprint gives me a place to know how far I've gotten along. What do I need to get to be able to just put it on the table and play a game? So if I don't have enough, then yeah, I don't have enough. If I don't have it painted, talked about this a little bit in hobby resolutions, like benchmarking your hobby resolutions. Well, I want to be able to play a 50-point game by X amount of time. It lets me plan my process, which models need to get done first, second, third, however it is. So I think standard game size or competitive game size formats, like however you want to approach it, like there being a X, this is the size game are you playing, this is how you play it, is useful, and then it gives you a way to benchmark your stuff. It lets people feel done too. I was talking about this with Clarence. We were filming an Old World Wars game. If you haven't watched Old World Wars, he's my buddy. We've been playing for like 15 years together. One of my oldest gaming friends, and we've played a gajillion games against each other. But he was talking about how he'd been painting some new stuff for his Dark Elf army for Warhammer. And he was like, and I'm still adding units to this army, which is crazy because this is something I never do. I usually build to X number of points, or I build my tournament army, and then I'm done. I shelf the army and I'm finished. And that's a really, for him, that's really satisfying. He's got his competitive list. He doesn't usually add a lot of options. It's this is what I want to take in this format. And then he's done, finished. You know, like it's on a shelf, it's complete. It gives him almost like an ending point to that creation, right? Once it's built, it's done. It doesn't need to have every unit in the army. He's not collecting every single thing that is in the list. And he was kind of surprised that he found his Dark Elves were getting him to change that mentality. He was actually adding Witch Elves. He added a Hydra and a whole bunch of new models. And they're all his oldest army. So for Clarence, his Dark Elves are a lot like my Dwarves. I've been playing Dwarves since ever, so for a long time. I have lots of really old dwarf miniatures that you guys haven't seen because they're still in boxes somewhere in storage. I found some actually that Steve saw today, and he was like, "What is that? Is that a hammer?" And I'm like, "No, that's just like a Morrison Murata era Citadel dwarf from like a gajillion years ago. It's probably made out of lead." And so it's a collection that I never feel is really finished, right? And Clarence, I guess, is kind of getting that for his Dark Elves. I think it's interesting though that lets people feel like they are finished. Like there's a cap on you know, their collection, and they've got it to a size now where they're finished. They've got their competitive list or their standard game size list, and they're done. I think that could be a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing from the point of view of you know, just feeling finished. But the flip side of that, you know, we'll talk about, it could maybe be constraining too. They don't feel like it could be a bad thing for the company, for sure, for the people selling those widgets, those miniatures, those books, whatever, that somebody feels finished. You know, they feel like they're done. And then I guess the last thing is it creates a framework for architects to create. And I say architects, I mean guys who love planning army lists. The standard game format thing, if you go to any forum that's about wargaming, you'll tend to find that in that forum there is something about posting army lists. And there are guys who love to tinker. And in other like hobbies, for instance, fantasy football, actually there's a big thing with my other hobby, backpacking, where it's about making gear lists and trying to get your weight as low as possible. Guys, guys have this idea in their head that their base weight, which is like, they call it a big three. It's your backpack, your sleeping pad, your sleeping bag, and then whatever your like essentials are. So basically the things that you'd have to take your tent. Those four things should come in under 10 pounds, because then you add everything else in and you probably have between 25 and 30 pounds of total weight on your back. The theory being that the less you're carrying, the farther you can go in a day, the more you're going to enjoy hiking because you've got a lighter backpack, right? And so there is a whole hobby that I swear is just like writing army lists online for wargaming, where guys tinker with how low can I get my base weight. They'll sew their own sleeping bags, they'll make their own sleeping pads, they'll drill out their toothbrush handles, they'll cut, you know, foam sleeping pads down to like 3/4 length, so it's just like your upper body and your legs and stuff are hanging off the pad. Anything to cut weight. And in wargaming, it's the same thing with tinkering. It's called min-maxing, sort of in wargaming speak, minimizing your investment in points to maximizing your output in games. And that tends to be something that people tend to like to do in a competitive format or in a standard game, is you're trying to get the most with the least. You're trying to get the best competitive or, you know, standard size army you can inside this framework. And so creating that framework, if it doesn't exist, guys don't get to do that tinkering, because there can't be you can't win at it. You know what I mean? You can't have a best way of or a most for least sort of ratio if there isn't a standard framework to work inside of. So I think those are the pros. Those are the ones I could come up with anyway. If you guys can think of other pros to that idea that there's a standard game size or standard game way to play a game or competitive format or whatever it is, there's basically a sandbox and this is how you play this war game, then post them in the comments and we'll talk about them. But let's talk about the cons as well. All right, so what could some of the downsides to a standard format or competitive format playing of a game, so that there's like a standard point size or that there's a right or wrong way to play a game? What could some of the downsides to that be? Well, the first one I can think of is that the games after a while that you play with that standard size army in a standard way can feel very samey and repetitive. And the example I'll best use for this is 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy. 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy, there was really one scenario in the rulebook, and it was called Pitched Battle. And that was how you played Warhammer Fantasy. It was one mission with several submissions, so it was a 12-inch deployment. It lasted 6 turns. At the end, you counted victory points, what you killed. You get 100 extra victory points for every banner you captured. You get 100 for killing the enemy general, and you get 100 for each quarter of the table that you contested. And 100 for the enemy battle standard, if you took the battle standard too. So while there were some minor victory conditions that you could try and accumulate, the really big thing in that game was kill your opponent. Line up 12 inches on the table, kill your opponent. And the army books at the time were formatted to standardize 2,000 point games. You got 1 lord at 2,000 points. 1999 and below, you got 0 lords. No lord choices whatsoever, but you could have a lord at 2,000 points. So for some reason, through mutually agreed, hive minding, and through the fact that pretty much every tournament run for Warhammer at that time in that edition of the game was set to 2,000 points. Everybody played 2,000 point games, and everybody played Pitched Battle. So it meant that the games, after, I think it was around for at least 4 years, felt very, very similar. And towards the end of 6th edition, I had my army, I liked my army, I didn't really play outside of the army that I'd built. I think I had 3 armies in 6th edition. I had a High Elf army, I had my Ogres. Actually, I started that Ogre army in 6th edition, and I had my Dwarves because I had my Dwarves forever, although that Dwarf army was actually, I don't even know if I still have that part of the Dwarf army because it was red and white, no, red and cream as opposed to white and blue. I think I might have gotten rid of it. But anyway, those 3 armies were the armies that I played with all through 6th edition, and I literally built them to 2,000 points and I was done. Like I took the army book, I wrote the army list I wanted in the army book, I bought those models, I painted them, and I was finished. And it was because there was one way to play the game. And if I wanted to play the game, if I wanted to play with a different army, I would actually write a whole new army list. I wouldn't even use the same. It was like they were like compartmentalized. And the games after a while, they were like rote. I probably played 25 or 30 games against Clarence in that edition with his Dark Elves, which were his first fantasy army that he finished because his original army was a 40k, which is Black Legion. But his Dark Elf army and I would say my High Elves and my Dwarves for sure. I played like tons and tons of games against him. And those games, we almost knew what was going to happen after a while before they even started. Like I could actually tell you probably his army list for that 2,000 point army, like still today, because it was the same army all the time. And because he was a really slow painter back then. But he could probably tell you my army as well. He could probably tell you my Ogre army because it didn't change a lot. Like it had Giants, it had Tenderizer Lord, it had lots of Bulls, lots of Iron Guts. But yeah, it was pretty sameish all the way around. And there's also less models that you could choose from back then because the Ogres had just been released. There was not a lot of stuff for them. So yeah, the game could feel sort of samey over time. You get into a repetitive kind of like, I guess, tempo with playing your games, how you play them, what you bring. And honestly, after a while, it bums me out. I start game hopping when that happens. I will hop between game systems whenever I feel like the games I'm playing are just the same thing over and over and over again. One of the reasons I've been really enjoying playing War Machine in the last little while is because I'm excited about the 2015 Steamroller pack. That's going to come out. It's going to change how we play the game again. I got to get into and play a bunch of games in this last edition, and now I'm going to get into and get to sort of have a reset button hit and feel refreshed and excited about how I'm playing games again. I might change the models I use, paint more models, get my collection to be even bigger, although my War Machine model collection is ridiculous now. So yeah, games can feel samey. Another one is you might feel like you can't play until you've hit that like legit level of like, oh, this is the right size of game. Now I can play the game. And that might hold people back or even bump people out. You just bought a cool collection of models. You're really excited about them, but you don't feel like you can play yet because you haven't hit that level. Or you don't play yet because you can't afford to get to that level. And I think that's a shame. Like, I enjoy just as much. Actually, I talked about this a little bit in the comments section for a recent Old World Wars that got posted, where Steve and I played Regiments of Renown, which is basically kill teams for Warhammer Fantasy. Regiments of Renown is an awesome way to just play with a couple of fantasy units, because fantasy takes a lot of time to finish what you have. And if you're like me and you have a paint and play rule, where you don't play with stuff until it's painted, then you're probably going to be waiting a while to play a huge game, a 2,000 point game at least of fantasy. Which means games like that, they're just as legit a game. And I don't feel like I shouldn't play with my miniatures until I hit 2,000 points. I think this finding a way to enjoy the toys that you have and the toys that you've finished is super important in any hobby. So that's something that's sort of like what a standard game size is. The mentality of I can't do it yet, I don't have enough stuff, or I don't have enough stuff done, I think is counterproductive, and that could be, again, a pitfall or a trap. People have varying ideas of what standard is. It's funny, when I first started doing Old World Wars, lots of people wrote into me about, hey, why aren't you guys playing with blah format or this format or that format? And I found that fascinating, because to them, that's what normal is. That is the right way to play the game. Didn't occur to me that that would even be the case, because there's my own mental what a standard game size is, sort of like template that's fitting in my head. And that's what we just started playing to. And I mean, and it was fairly universal. I mean, it wasn't like I was playing in a way that was weird or abnormal for everybody in this area. Most people in this area play Warhammer Fantasy Battle the way that I play. Now, on the flip side, I was very much that guy when I got back into War Machine. I was like, well, why don't we just use some of these scenarios from the rulebook? People were like, we don't use those scenarios. No, we use Steamroller. What's wrong with you? Like, nobody ever uses these scenarios. These scenarios are garbage. They're terrible. Throw them away. Throw them in the garbage. And I'm like, well, what parts of this rulebook do you guys still use? And like, we just use the rules part. We don't really use anything else. We use the rules part, and then we use all the Steamroller stuff. And I had to bend my mind around that's the size games that we would be playing and how we'd be playing them. So that was interesting too. And the last sort of like downside that I can see to this is that same idea, there's a blueprint to build inside of. It can potentially make certain models or units seem less attractive. Not because they're bad in the game, but they might not be as cost effective, or they might not fit that template as well as other units, and things get marginalized. We see that in almost every army list. When you see somebody saying something's crap online, what they're usually saying is there might be something that does the job better in an army list. So for instance, I was having this discussion with Steve today. What was I talking about? I was talking about a unit which was, I need to remember. I literally had to go ask Steve what that was because it was going to bother me if I didn't get it right. We were talking about the Tau. I just finished painting 3 Riptides and 4 Tau Flyers for the Studio Tau Army, which used to be my Tau Army, so that's why I was painting some stuff for, because I could match it. And yeah, the reason we're talking about it was you said, well, the Flyers are really good, and I would take them in almost any army. And I said, yeah, they are good, but people don't tend to take them because they can take Riptides. And he's like, well, what do you mean? I was like, well, for the points, the Riptide can do the job because it can get Skyfire of a Flyer, of either defending against Flyers or hunting Flyers or whatever. Plus, it can do all this other stuff, and it's tougher and it's harder to kill. So it kind of takes a backseat. So it's not that the Tau Flyers weren't bad Flyers. It was that there was another option in the army that you could still take more than one of that did the work that other thing did, plus a whole bunch of other work that was really awesome. So why wouldn't you take this other unit, which is the Riptide? And that was kind of how I wanted to illustrate my point, is when you have, let's say, like 1,500 points to play with, if you're playing 40K, and that's your standard game size, because that's actually my preferred game size for 40K, then you're going to trade off something that can do 2 jobs better for something that just does 1 job fairly well, if it's worth the same points. If they kind of fit the same niche, one might be slightly better, and the other one gets put on the side. And again, I think that's a shame, because the fact is that it's not like those units are bad, but you might not ever buy them or enjoy them. Or worse yet, you might be really passionate about the one unit that's kind of marginalized. You might look at it and go, oh, it's so cool, and I want to use it, and I want to buy it, and I want to paint it, and I want to build it. But this thing's so much better that I don't like quite as much. So I think that's a hard thing. But that whole idea that there's a standard game size, that architectural blueprint that you're working inside of, that people have so much fun tinkering with, stuff might start getting excluded because it doesn't necessarily fit inside that sandbox. So there we go. There's my pros and cons on standard game sizes and formats. Just stuff to chew on and think about. I honestly think that in this case, the pros outweigh the cons, being able to roll up to a gaming table kind of anywhere and play a standard size game and understand the people you're playing with will probably play the same game, the same way as you, is really powerful. I could play War Machine against almost anybody on Earth, and we'd probably show up with 50-point armies. And we'd all be playing with a Steamroller pack. So I think that's really cool. Now, likewise, there's part of me that goes, I don't want people to tell me how to play, and I want to play my own games. And that's the part of me that says, I really enjoyed playing Regiments Renown last week. And I think that's just as cool as playing a full game of Fantasy. But I don't think that one of those things is mutually exclusive. I think that having the standard game size is really awesome for all the things that it does. But I think being able to have your mind liberated enough to know that people don't have to play that way, and it's not right, it's just different, is the really important message here. Because there's pros and cons to both, to having a standard game size and a standard format. But just like anything in life, when you're being exclusionary, the person you tend to be excluding the most is you. So when you're excluding yourself, you're excluding possibilities, the thing that you're really excluding is that you actually try it and maybe have fun doing something else. So I think it's really powerful. I think being prepared for and having that standard format is really cool, really good. But like anything in life, dealing in absolutes is never perfect. So it is not necessarily the right way to play. It's just a way to play, and it has all these benefits. So open your mind, liberate yourself, and play all the games that you want the way that you want to play them. But if you do have a standard game way of playing, that gives you the power of being able to go play a stranger and probably have a good time. So there we go. There's my talk on competitive and standard game sizes. So let's check out what's on the painting table. All right, so here we have on the painting table. So on my painting table this week, nothing finished. Lots of stuff on the go. First and foremost, 3 gyrocopters. My squadron of dwarf gyrocopters, which I'm pretty excited about. He's going to give the much needed mobility to my dwarf army. And the reason you want to have 3 is because half rounded up can have Vanguard. So it's a lot like drop pods for Space Marines in 40k. Because half of them can have the Vanguard rule, that means that they can move 12 inches before the game starts. And because they're 20-inch flyers, if you go first, you're more likely than not behind the enemy turn 1. If you go second, they move up a little bit, and then vice versa. So Vanguard's super handy to have. Your third one can just do point defense, but they're cheap enough, 80 points, 20 points more for Vanguard, so 280 points for the 3 of them. They're kind of an auto-include in a dwarf army now. And because they are specials, they don't eat up a whole bunch of stuff. Also, I got some guild guards for Malifaux, just some personal stuff I've been working on. These are the old metal guild guards. The new plastic ones are quite different, but I really like these old sculpts. And I've been painting them up for myself. If you want to talk to me about that game, obviously it's not covered by MiniWarGaming, and Matt has no plans to cover it, but hit me up on my Facebook page, and we can talk about that game if you want. And then I've got some line Kazakhs. One of whom is a Fort Observer. These are the old line Kazakhs from the original box set of Ariadne for Infinity. If you haven't seen these before, they are some venerable sculpts, but I quite like them. And this guy right here on the radio, I use as my Kazakh Forward Observer, because that would be the reason he's on a radio. It just makes sense to me, which would be handy if I had a mule, tractor mule, which I eventually plan to get. Again, these are some of the original, these are the first Infinity box that I bought, actually. And I did some custom bases for them with plastic art and stuff like that. And they've had their base coats airbrushed, but I need these so I can get some options in my, my Ariadne army. So there, and that's what's on the painting table for this week. Alright guys, once again, thanks for watching The Machine Shop. This episode being about sort of standard competitive game formats and styles, pros and cons, drawbacks and strengths and weaknesses. You also got to see what's on my painting table. I hope you join me next week for another Machine Shop, where we'll talk about I don't know what, which is je ne sais quoi. We'll see the comments and stuff that come on, and maybe something will spark some interest. I've got a couple things boiling, which I may or may not talk about this week or next week. I have to percolate a little bit more and plan my shows out. But like always, if you have something cool or something you want to discuss or an idea for a episode of The Machine Shop, post about it in the comments below. The best place to get to somewhere where I can see it is usually the comments on my Facebook page, because that's going to go to my phone. I'll see it. Or you can reply to anything I post on the YouTube channel itself. Stuff on the MiniWarGaming site, it's just hard to navigate the comments in that section, so I don't tend to actually go there for stuff in the Machine Shop. But I try to go every now and again. So yeah, if you want to talk to me about anything wargaming related, other games that I play, or general wargaming shenanigans, you can check out my Facebook page. It's facebook.com/outofthebasement into the streets, and there'll be all kinds of wargaming stuff on there too, for games that are covered here, Older Wars and War Machine stuff, and Infinity, and obviously other games that MiniWarGaming doesn't actually cover too. So come check me out there. Until next time, this is Ash with the Machine Shop. Happy wargaming.